I wasn't really excited about my first take on this lecture. So I'm going to try to take two. Looking at the kingdom of Israel. Now, the kingdom of Israel, what we're looking at is how they move from the Exodus into their kingdom phase, and also to highlight their golden age of the kingdom. Now, when the Israelites came up from Egypt, they came back to Canaan, and Canaan was not an empty place. It was full of people. In fact, when we look at the Jewish people as they left for Egypt, there was only 70 people that left Canaan and moved down to Egypt. Now, when they return, you have anywhere from 10 to 15,000 to up to a million or 2 million people that move back in. Okay, I think that number is closer to that 10 to 15,000 number, maybe up to 50,000, but it's not going to be a huge group. Based about the size of Pullman moving back. Okay. Now, when you look at this map, you have the Philistines, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, the Amorites, Amalekites, I think it is. I mean, you have all these different Edomites. You have all these different people, and they live here. They have their families here. These are basically clans or tribes, small kingdoms that have lived here. Now, the Philistines, this group could be a group that are refugees from Troy. About 1200 BCE, after Troy is sacked by the other Greek people, these Philistines, who are Greek people, moved down into this territory. They could be the sea people. They could be refugees from Troy. There is not solid evidence. It's a theory that people are looking at. And so it's kind of an interesting theory. Now, as the Jewish people move in, Joshua is one of the first judges, and they are working their way into this territory, trying to fight and reconquer or conquer some of this territory. I don't want to say reconquer because only 70 people lived here before. Okay, that's just a couple of households, right? If you have 7 people in a house, it's 10 houses. So it's not even a full neighborhood, just a small group of people. Now this group of people are coming back to conquer Canaan and to move back as a nation. And the judges are in charge of those 12 different tribes. And they can be prophets, they can be military leaders, they are all over the place. They're basically chiefs. Now, as they are attacking and working their way into this area, you do see different prominent judges. There was one female judge, her name was Deborah, and we don't know exactly her date, but about 1200 to about 1050, somewhere in that 150 years time frame, Deborah lived. And she led the people in a battle against some of these other nations out there. Another one, just for interest, I'd talk about Samson. Now, Samson, he was a Nazarite, I believe, and Nazarites believed that if they didn't cut their hair, they would devote themselves to God. Now, Samson, he is an interesting story because he does not rely on anyone else. He is out there fighting the Philistines by himself. And even though he does have a Philistine wife, Delilah, he is battling Philistines, and it talks about his exploits of killing thousands of Philistines using just his same brute strength. Eventually, though, Delilah discovers that it is his hair that is his source of strength, and so she is able to cut his hair when he sleeps and sell him off to her Philistine family. And they take him, they blind him and bind him up, and he's captive. But one of his final feats of strength is where he knocks over the temple of Dagon, and kills about 3,000 people that are there. Prominent priests, okay, those are another set of the judges. Now, Samuel, he is the last of the prominent priests. We will have other priests that they name throughout our Israelite history, but Samuel is the prominent priest of that judges period. He is the one that anoints the next kings of Israel. Okay, the first king that Samuel anointed was a man named Saul. Saul was it's not even a kingdom yet. We still have just small collections of Jewish communities. And Saul, I think the only archaeological evidence that I've heard about Saul was a small fort that may have been Saul's palace. But Saul was a warrior that led the fights against these people. and he was considered a king. Okay. Now Saul may have had some manic issues where he had these severe mood swings. And when we look at his relationship with David, we really see a lot of these mood swings. Now, Saul lost favor with Samuel, and so Samuel, or with God, however you want to interpret it, but Samuel anointed David as to be the next king, which is controversial because Saul was still alive. And the story goes that David, in some of their battles, they were fighting against the Philistines, and David came to the forefront and noticed that this one giant, a guy named Goliath, was challenging the Israelites to a fight. One thing that's kind of interesting across cultures, and it's not all the time, but sometimes you'll have these battle of champions or trial by combat where people will settle their differences with one-on-one fighting. I know Shaka Zulu down in the south of Africa, he used some of these tricks with one-on-one fights. We can talk about that later on, though. But Goliath was out there challenging the Israelites to a fight. Send me a champion. We don't have to kill the whole army. Just give us one guy. David went out there and used a slingshot to pelt Goliath on the forehead with a rock, knock him out. Then he went up and chopped his head off. So David became a instant darling with the Jewish people. Now, Saul brought David into his household. David would play the harp, would entertain Saul and his family. But on other occasions, Saul would try to kill David, throwing spears at him, trying to attack him, all those things. And so there are these stories of this cat and mouse game where Saul is trying to attack David, kill David. David is retreating, trying not to engage Saul. There's one time Saul goes to the bathroom and David cuts his coat and sends it back to him, says, "Hey, I could have killed you, but I only, cut off a piece of your coat while you're going to the bathroom to show you that I have no ill will against you." But David ran away, and he had to stay away from Saul, and he ran away to the Philistines, and he lived with the Philistines for a bit. Now, even though he lived with the Philistines, David was best friends with one of Saul's sons, Jonathan, and he actually married one of Saul's daughters, Michal. That was David's first wife. Now, as Saul lived on, he was still battling these other kingdoms, trying to solidify the Jewish hold on the land of Canaan. His final battle, he saw his 3 sons die, and Saul ran away and fell on his sword. He didn't want to be captured, and so he tried to kill himself. There's some disputes about what happened there too, because an Amalekite said he had to go up and kill Saul after Saul tried to kill himself. Now, after all that happened, Saul had left one son, Ishbosheth, in charge, and he inherited the kingdom. But David and Ishbosheth had a civil war for the next several years. Eventually, by age 30, David became the king of Israel. And he continued to fight to solidify the control of the Jews in this territory. It's under David that the Jewish people finally get control of Jerusalem. And that would be an important site because that is a site of the shrine of Abraham sacrificing his son Ishmael or Isaac. As time goes on, David does acquire other wives. One of his wives is actually married to one of his soldiers, a soldier named Uriah, and his wife is named Bathsheba. And while Uriah is out in battle one day, Bathsheba and David have an affair, and she gets pregnant with David's first son of her. And Uriah is not tricked. He brings Uriah home to hopefully confuse the parentage of this kid that Bathsheba has. Uriah will not abandon the soldier, so he's sent back to the front, where David says, put him in the front line and have him get killed. That happens. And so with Uriah dead, David marries Bathsheba, and David loses support with a lot of his soldiers because they see how he treated one of his best soldiers. Now, Uriah was a Hittite. He wasn't Jewish. That's something that is interesting to see. So David's dealing with Philistines, with Hittites. Um, he's, that culture is not just straight up Jewish. There are many other cultures he's associated with. Now, as David loses support with some of the soldiers, some of the soldiers actually throw support behind some of his sons from his previous wife, Absalom. He wages a civil war against his father. David actually ruled for about 40 years, so there's plenty of time for these battles to go on. But Absalom is killed in battle. He's retreating and he gets his hair caught in a tree, is what I've always read. And then one of David's captains comes up and kills him while he's hanging from this tree. Another son that leads a rebellion against him is Adonijah. And Adonijah, he leads the battle. I'm not sure what happened in that battle, but it doesn't work out very well for Adonijah either. Now, Solomon is David's second son with his wife Bathsheba. His first son only lived a couple of weeks. But then Solomon, he grows up, and David finally names Solomon his successor to the throne. Now, once David dies, Solomon is the first real king that has a period of peace in the Israelite kingdom. And he finishes, or he builds the temple in Jerusalem. And this is the first temple. It becomes the center of Jewish culture and economy. Solomon also goes through and he takes the shrines down that Abraham and other prophets had put up around the land of Canaan, and he directs all of the religious worship toward this temple. He takes the tabernacle that was this mobile tent we talked about last time. It's still, the temple is based on that same floor plan with the Holy of Holies in the back, holy structure in the middle, and then the courtyard has the altar and that wash basin. Now, Solomon's rule has really become a focus of inflation or exaggeration, because they think that his kingdom couldn't have been this powerful. Okay, they say he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. I know last week I said he had 300 wives. Okay, that was just his concubines. A concubine is a woman who serves as a wife but doesn't have the legal status of a wife. So we don't know how many kids Solomon had, but there would be thousands of kids. Now, another thing that Solomon has is 1,400 chariots. That is a very large army for this time frame. So a lot of people look at that and say, is this number of wives and the number of chariots just added to Solomon to make him appear to be more powerful than he actually was? Because when it comes to archaeology, there's not a lot of evidence of David or Solomon or even Saul. They have some shards of pottery that refer to the house of David, but they don't have, unfortunately, they can't really find that first temple because it was destroyed in 586 BCE. Other things have been built there. In fact, right now, the Dome of the Rock is built where this first temple would have been. And so archaeologically, they can't really dig into some of these things. Now, after Solomon dies, Israel declines pretty quickly. It actually splits into two. You have the northern 10 tribes of Israel that exist for another 10 kings. And then the southern 2 tribes called Judah. They have 20 kings. And Judah is in charge or in control of Jerusalem. Now the 10 tribes up north, they are lost contact with. People don't know what happened to them. They blend into society and into history, and they are lost probably within about 400 to 500 years. So about 500 BCE, we do not really have any idea where those 10 lost tribes are. In fact, they'll be referred to as the 10 lost tribes. Now, some people have different religious faiths that they believe they know where the 10 lost tribes are. Latter-day Saints make a claim, and it's not supported, but they make the claim that Native Americans are one of those lost tribes of Israel. When you look at American history, there's a lot of interesting theories where people will claim where Native Americans came from. Some people say the lost Welsh tribe. It's fascinating to see what theories people come up with. But the tribes of Judah, or the kingdom of Judah, it lasts on into the Roman Empire. and we'll talk about what happens with them, because the Jewish people have nowadays come from those two tribes of Judah. And when we get to Rome, we'll see how they become part of our modern day history as well. Now, again, to show how quickly Jerusalem fell apart, or the kingdom of Israel fell apart, within 5 years of Solomon's death, Shishak, he is a pharaoh from Egypt. He attacks Jerusalem. He sacks the temple. He does take some of the temple treasures back home to Egypt with him. Now, when he does this, the Egyptian resources do not mention Solomon. He just does say that he attacked Jerusalem and brought things home, but he doesn't mention the king or any of the people from that time frame. But Shishak is that first real connection. Now, we don't know if he took the Ark of the Covenant or if the Ark of the Covenant was gone before this time frame or hidden somewhere as well. The final sacking of the temple is in 586 BCE, and that's going to be the subject of one of our next lectures. Okay, now here's your assignment. Okay, this movie. Okay, I watched this movie last night. It wasn't that good. It was actually back in when I was a little kid, they had this thing called spaghetti westerns, and that's where they would take people into Italy, and they would watch or create Western movies in Italy. It was cheaper to make movies in Italy than it was in the United States. So a lot of the really cheap movies were made over in Italy from the 1960s on through the 70s. Okay, this is a spaghetti Bible classic. Orson Welles, he was a famous actor in the United States for a long time. He goes and he plays King Saul. But this movie is really not that very good. It's fascinating to watch just for its cultural aspects, because in the 1950s and 60s, this was the start of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, that was a country that was communist, and they did not, they advocated that religion was not good for people. And so they were very anti-religious. In the 1950s, the United States added "under God" to our Pledge of Allegiance, because we wanted to delineate our belief in God, and more specifically, to be a Christian at that time frame. And so the United States took some steps to accentuate the Christian culture that we were founded on. Now, in 1960, that's when this movie was made. This movie kind of reflects that culture, more of the Cold War culture. Okay, it looks at David and Goliath, it reenacts some of those biblical scenes, and it's fascinating to see how they do this. Okay, I have not watched other David and Goliath movies. I think I saw one that was made either in the last 2 or 3 years. It'd be fascinating to compare that movie to this movie. I'm not going to do it. But it'd be fascinating to look at those differences. But here's the discussion, okay? What current events will be reflected in our art, books, and movies coming up? Okay, we've had lots of stuff. In fact, COVID is one of the big things we've looked at. And then last week we had the storming of the Capitol. But how are these events going to be reflected in our art? Okay? And then, we should discuss that a little bit. What is going to come out? Okay, it's going to be fascinating to see what come out. And there's, again, no right or wrong answer, but what is going on right now in our lives, working from home, working remotely from classes, that sort of thing, and how is that going to be reflected in the movies, music, books that we come up with. Hope you guys have a good time. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, and I'll talk to you guys later.